Hi, I'm James, and in this video we're continuing to look at the plagues in Exodus. We saw in the last section that the plagues are God's answer to Pharaoh's question from Exodus chapter 5, who is Yahweh that I should obey him? In the first three plagues, Yahweh revealed that he is a God who executes justice with mercy and holds great power over the whole of creation. As we move into the next section, we remember that Pharaoh has just rejected even the statement of his spiritual advisors that the finger of the Lord is in this judgment. We see the three-part pattern from the previous plagues repeated here. First, God sends Aaron and Moses to Pharaoh again with the command to let Israel go. He warns that intense swarms of flies will be sent into the land. But unlike the previous plagues, this time God is going to protect the land of Goshen where his people live. There will be no flies in that area. And like the first plague, God gives his reason in verse 22, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. Yahweh is bringing this cycle of plagues to show that only he, the author of existence, has ultimate authority over Pharaoh and his kingdom. By exercising his power over nature while protecting Israel from it, he will show that he alone has the right to decide how Israel, his covenant people, are to be treated and cared for. In the next verse, we hear of the plague coming about. As with the frogs, this plague is a commanding of creatures into the land. And for the first time, the narrator describes the effect of this plague on Egypt. In verse 24 there, we see dense swarms of flies pour into the house, and throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by flies. This great nation is being ravaged by the cumulative effect of these plagues. Yet those who are under God's care and protection are unscathed. Following this, as per usual, Pharaoh responds. We don't hear anything of the magicians who failed to replicate the last plague, but like with the frogs, Pharaoh tries to barter for prayer, but he still does it on his terms. His nation is ruined, and yet Pharaoh still seeks to dictate the terms of Israel's release. Go and sacrifice. Go and sacrifice as your God has asked, but do it here in the land. Now, Moses refused to disobey God's command. God has said from the beginning that they must go out of the land, 3 days' journey to worship. And behind that is the reality that this is ultimately about Israel's freedom, not just about a service of worship. But Moses also knows how the Egyptians would hate Israel worshipping a different God in their land. He suggests it would be lethal to them. Will they not stone us? And so he demands to obey the Lord, protect the people, and request to go into the wilderness. Now Pharaoh agrees, and Moses warns him not to go back on his promise. But as with the frogs, once again, once Yahweh removes the danger, Pharaoh hardens his heart once more. This pattern begins again at the beginning of chapter 9. This time, Yahweh will cause the Egyptians' livestock to die. This judgment is coming closer to home than the previous ones. It's not just the main source of water rendered unusable, but there are wells that can be dug and water to be found, or indeed anything like varying degrees of infestation. Now, these are all terrifying things in their own right. But what we're talking about in the livestock is their livelihood, their main source of food, perhaps even the Egyptians' means of sacrificial worship being affected here. We also see a precursor for the next plague. The Lord has power to bring sickness on living things. He has the power to affect a creature's biology. Pharaoh's continued hardness of heart is being challenged more now, and Israel's protection is accentuated to make Pharaoh realise that he really is under Yahweh's authority. In verse 5 and 6, the plague comes about. We get repeated language here to really accentuate the Lord's hand in these things. We might be inclined to think that these are naturalistic events, but the narrative wants us to be certain that the Lord is at work. The Lord did it. The Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. And we get that, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigates and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. This is very much a re-accentuating of God's hand in God's judgment. In our cycle, we then get Pharaoh's response in verse 7. He sends investigators round to confirm Yahweh's protection of Israel has come about. But even with a favourable report, it has no effect. His heart has become unyielding. Now, this is a development of his heart state on from the last couple of times we were told Pharaoh's response. When we compare how Pharaoh responds each time, we see an interesting progression from Pharaoh's heart becoming hard because of the Egyptian magician's capacity to replicate the blood from the water, to hardening his heart when he sees the frogs, to his heart being hard, because his heart was hard, not listening, the effect of the hardening of his heart being that he naturally will not listen, even when his spiritual advisors say, this is definitely God. And then in this cycle of the plagues, he hardens his heart like he did with the frogs, so he does with the flies. And in the next plague, his heart was unyielding. It's like with the gnats, but we can see a clear progression. It's not just a hard heart, but it's an unyielding heart. At this point, there seems little hope of Pharaoh turning his heart towards the Lord. In verse 8, the pattern begins again. Yahweh tells Moses to act in unilateral judgment against Egypt and Pharaoh. They don't go to Pharaoh with a command and a warning, but rather just perform the plague. Now, something that becomes clear at this point is that the plagues are in cycles of 3. So we get 2 warning judgments, 2 warning plagues, which Pharaoh rejects, and a 3rd decisive unilateral judgment for Pharaoh's hardness of heart. Pharaoh rejects the flood and the frogs, and so God decisively acts in the judgment of gnats for Pharaoh's recanting on the promise to release Israel. In this cycle, Pharaoh rejects the flies and the plague on the livestock, and now Pharaoh acts decisively to judge in the plague on the Egyptian people for Pharaoh's relentless rejection of God's call to release Israel. Now, this plague does indeed happen. We see details of that in verses 10 and 11, and this is the first judgment that directly affects the person. The first judgment that is a fundamental affecting of or changing of the nature of the human body. As we thought before, the flood and the frogs and the gnats and the flies are all very external impacts. The plague on the livestock is one step closer. And now, God causes the Egyptians to become very ill. The magicians who had rivaled the first couple of plagues can't even stand. But what's interesting here is that, unlike with the plague on the livestock, this isn't lethal. God doesn't choose to kill the Egyptians. He has the power to, clearly, and just as we thought with the turning of the Nile into blood, it would have been quite easy, even pragmatic perhaps, to do so. But instead, God shows his authority and his mercy. He shows that he has the right and the power over the people of Egypt and over Pharaoh, but he doesn't just wipe them out. The last verse here, verse 12, speaks of Pharaoh's response. He refuses to release Israel once again, but this time something different happens. It is the Lord who hardens Pharaoh's heart. Up till now, as we thought before, it's been Pharaoh hardening his heart, but now the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now, this might seem quite strange. We may even think it morally outrageous. Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? Surely he wants Pharaoh to release Israel. Wouldn't it be easier to do that? I want to pause briefly here to make a point about how narrative interacts with doctrine, which is the whole Bible's picture of a particular bit of truth. As we read different parts of the Bible, we build a picture of who God is and what it means if the claim he exists is true. So we might see this moment in the narrative and ask, Did the Lord harden Pharaoh's heart every time in the narrative so far? Now, that might have moral implications. And that may correspond with a whole Bible picture of who God is. But to be able to formulate any doctrine correctly, we have to let each part of the Bible speak clearly so we don't misinterpret it. Whether God has a hand in the hardening or softening of hearts moment by moment, the narrative is making the specific point that the Lord is acting in a particular way right here. Whether or not God was involved previously, he is involved now in a particular way that distinguishes it from anything else. To answer the question, does God have a hand in the hardening or softening of hearts moment by moment, we have to explore what else the Bible has to say on the issue. But to hear what this passage is saying and contributing to that big picture, we have to seek to understand what the Lord is doing specifically now, and perhaps even to distinguish that against what we might see in previous sections. To work that out, the context of the cycle that we've been looking at helps us in two ways. Now, the cycle helps us first to explore this within the context of God's intent from back in chapter 8, verse 22, that the Pharaoh and that the reader would know God's authority over all. Remember, so that you would know that I, the Lord, am in this land. In this third plague, God's authority over all people is exercised over even Pharaoh's heart. This is certainly a claim to complete authority over creation. The cycle also helps us to explore the immediate context of being the third plague in the cycle. And the third plague in the cycle is unilateral judgment. God here is judging Pharaoh for actively refusing to release his slaves, despite 5 nation-ravaging plagues that show his power. Long gone is the time when Pharaoh seemed a reasonable adversary as he ignored God's authority. And yet he hardens his heart. He continually chooses to hate God more and more. The narrative accentuates Pharaoh's choice in the previous plagues, and so must we if we are to interpret the text correctly. Perhaps God sees Pharaoh's desire to hate God and knows that he just will not relent. Perhaps God decides that the time is past to give Pharaoh the opportunity to. Rather, God chooses now to give Pharaoh what he so clearly wants. Paul tells us in the first chapter of Romans that when humankind habitually chose to reject God and to choose to live for themselves, that God gave them over to that desire. The message of the whole Bible is that by nature we hate who God is and fight against him at every turn. Because of our hatred for God, we are all rightly deserving his judgment. A judgment just like the plagues and worse. Ultimately, we all deserve death. But this God has given us a chance to turn to him, to be forgiven the ways we have hated him and rejected him by trusting in his Son. This God who could choose to unilaterally judge all those who hate him, instead came to die in our place and to rise to point us to the eternal reality to come. We're each given the choice to harden our hearts or to turn towards the God who loves us so much that he came to earth to die to save us. This passage is a warning not to keep hardening our hearts for too long. Because like for Pharaoh, the day will come when we will be given over to our desires. And we will absolutely deserve the punishment for what we have chosen to love. As we pause here before the next cycle, Yahweh has revealed that he is authoritative over mankind and has warned of the consequence of rejecting his merciful authority. Pharaoh has seemingly rejected God too much, and now we are left wondering just what will happen in the final cycle of plagues. And that's for the next video. Thank you so much for checking out the video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. If you'd like to ask a question about anything, please do feel free to get in touch. There were a couple of particularly sticky thoughts, weren't there, towards the end. I'd really love to explore those more with you. If you'd like to, do feel free to chuck some thoughts at me.